last few years, there have been a number of studies carried out through ENIGMA trying to understand a little bit about what happens to the brain's structure in schizophrenia. One of those studies has been about a study of what's known as diffusion tensor imaging, which is a long way of saying it looks at essentially the wiring of the brain. So in between the various cortical areas in the brain, you have these long wires known as axons that are carefully wrapped in a biological tissue known as myelin that makes it possible for signals to pass very efficiently from one part of the brain to the other. Now, in a number of disorders, and schizophrenia is a primary example of this, that myelination just goes a little bit awry, such that as the brain develops, you see a less efficient communication system in the brain, and that seems to be one of the things that matters for the kinds of functional problems that we see in schizophrenia. For a number of years there have been suggestive evidence of white matter deficits or deficits in that kind of wiring integration in schizophrenia. The problem is it wasn't a very clear picture. So some studies emphasized some aspects of the brain, some studies emphasized other aspects. And what we did was we tried to bring together the largest study to date of schizophrenia, which involved 4,000 participants from across the world, 29 sites. And we were able to show definitively for the first time that no matter actually where you looked in the brain, you could see this generalized pattern of decline in white matter integrity. So it was very important for us. It was published earlier this year in the journal Molecular Psychiatry. And now the question is, so now that we know this, that you get these really reliable differences between patients and controls, what's the functional impact of that? So we've been doing this follow-up study over the last year now that looks at this impact of white matter integrity on cognition in the brain. That's important because in schizophrenia, what matters for your ability to hold down a job or engage in meaningful relationships is the cognitive deficits that you see, a change in IQ, problems with memory, problems with attention. So it was a really obvious question for us, wasn't it, to know, well, now that we see these very reliable changes in white matter, might that be part of what drives the problems with cognition? So it really has been pulling that work together.
So like Gary said as well, with the widespread abnormalities that are associated with schizophrenia and white matter, there wasn't a lot of reliability in the literature, so we're gone back now to collect large-scale data and look at the relationship between IQ and white matter in schizophrenia and controls. So it's kind of bringing it to the next level from what we already know. One of the advances that we're talking about is trying to understand more about the relationship between cognition and white matter microstructure, or the connections, as Gary said, the wiring between the different brain regions. And previously the literature said that there is a strong relationship between some areas of the brain and the connections in those areas, and how we would score, say, on IQ tests, but there is also opposing literature to that too. So right now we're looking at developing our understanding so we can understand more about the relationship that exists between white matter microstructure and neurocognition, because it's been shown to be one of the most important things for functioning in a patient's daily life.
Schizophrenia affects somewhere between 1 in 100 and 1 in 200 people, and that's very consistent across populations around the world. There's quite consistent epidemiological evidence to suggest that's the case. While there's been an enormous amount of debate about what causes schizophrenia, the reasons that one person might be more likely to develop schizophrenia has become very clear in the last 10 to 20 years. An enormous advance for the field has been in the ability to really know, to establish that the lion's share of risk for schizophrenia, 80% of risk for schizophrenia, is attributable to genetic factors, with the remaining percentage due to a number of environmental factors that have to do with cannabis use, living in urban areas, growing up in urban areas, and a number of other factors. So one of the really exciting things in the field of schizophrenia has been the advances in genetic studies, and particularly a kind of genetic study known as genome-wide association studies, which have identified now well over 100 areas of the human genome that are associated with schizophrenia. And it's an interesting picture. It's right across the genome, rather than, previously we thought there might have been a gene for schizophrenia. Now it's really clear this is a much more general picture. So for us, what's really interesting is to ask the question, so how does that link up? How does that genetic inheritance link up with how the brain develops, and what's different about the brain in schizophrenia versus healthy participants? It's fair to say that we're at the early stages of understanding how genetic factors result in the biological brain changes that increase risk for schizophrenia. There's an awful lot we don't know about it. In our group, we're pursuing a number of hypotheses, the main one being an immune hypothesis, that there's something about how the brain is impacted by early environmental adversity, by infection in the womb and so on, that might tilt the axis of development. One of the things that happens later in adolescence is cannabis use. You can look around the hospitals of many major cities and countries for young people in their first episode of psychosis, and what's really clear is the high use of cannabis and the strong association between that use and not just the risk for schizophrenia, but how soon those symptoms start to emerge and the severity of those symptoms. Now, it's probably fair to say that that's a contentious comment, not because the evidence isn't clear, but because we're used to thinking about marijuana as a benign drug. There's a very clear social narrative around that. But if you're trying to think about risk for schizophrenia, and particularly preventable causes of schizophrenia, one of the things you should really look at is the increased risk caused by marijuana use. And of course, when we think about this, unlike 30 or 40 years ago, when marijuana, the active ingredient, THC, was quite low, nowadays the content of cannabis is quite potent, and this is a real public health problem for not everybody. There'll be lots of people who will smoke and will be fine, but for that percentage of the population who's at genetically increased risk for schizophrenia, this is a really big issue.
Well, for the original paper that was published by Sinead Kelly and Gary, looking at widespread abnormalities in white matter microstructure, that was across 29 collaboration sites with nearly 4,000 participants, including controls and patients with schizophrenia. And right now we have data collected, neurocognitive data collected from 10 of those sites, along with the DTI data. So that sums up to about 1,700 participants. So it's a large sample size, much larger than anything that's previously been done in the literature. So we didn't have to collect raw imaging data from any of those sites. We just collected their output DTI parameters. So there was no raw imaging data sent to us, and then we did the statistical analysis based on the streamlined protocols which each site would have followed locally. One of the reasons that there's opposing findings in the literature is due to small sample sizes and the lack of power that you get with small sample sizes and the lack of reliability across multiple different analyses. So we're trying to increase our sample size as as high as possible, so that we can have more power and to detect actual, true, meaningful relationships between white matter microstructure and neurocognition.
What's really interesting about ENIGMA is you can work in for years and years collecting samples and doing analysis and getting papers published, but ENIGMA allows you to do definitive studies, the study that's just going to really be the touchstone in a particular area, I think for years to come, and it's very exciting to be part of it, and we've really enjoyed it. It's been great to work with very interesting collaborators around the world, and then to come together maybe every year or so and compare findings. And we're always looking for new people to work with us around this this exciting work. And we really hope it's going to matter. It's going to translate into a body of knowledge that can change future treatments for schizophrenia.